Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in for today's session. I'm David Cranston, Florida Energy Policy Manager for the Environmental Defense Fund. I work on power grid policy in the Sunshine States. When I say grid, I'm talking about the infrastructure that provides our electricity. When you flip a light switch or hear your air conditioner kick on, the grid is working to meet your needs. It's a massive nationwide network. It's physical infrastructure like poles and wires you see on your streets or the power plants outside town, and it's the digital infrastructure that manages power flows from control rooms. The grid has multiple levels. Today we're focusing on one, the transmission system. It's the towers and wires that you see traversing open spaces and stretching many miles. These transmission lines deliver our electricity from where it's produced to the cities and towns where it's consumed. Although it doesn't make energy, transmission can help expand clean energy while making energy more affordable for all. And now, a federal rule called Order 1920 has created a path for our transmission system to achieve its full potential. I'm here with two panelists who will break this down for us. Zach Zimmerman is the Research and Policy Manager at Grid Strategies, and Adam Kurland is a federal energy attorney at the Environmental Defense Fund. Zach and Adam, thank you for being here. Let's start with the basics. Zach, we hear a lot these days about the need to build more power generation to meet increasing electricity demand and decarbonization goals. Can you give an overview of how the transmission system can be used as another tool to help meet those needs, and in particular, how transmission can facilitate the growth of clean energy?
Yes, thanks, David, and happy to be here today talking about the grid. As you so eloquently put in your introduction, the grid is critical to moving electrons around and making sure that people have power when they flip a switch and try to turn the lights on. We've heard a lot in recent months or over the past year about the increase in demand for electricity from things like data centers and artificial intelligence or new manufacturing. But there also is a need for new electricity demand that comes from things like electrification. So if you think about switching over gas-powered cars to electric vehicles, converting appliances in your house from gas to electric, all of those things are going to require new sources, like new electricity demand, or create new electricity demand. And that plus the AI data center load growth mean that are going to have to probably double or triple our transmission capacity over the next few decades. So this is a significant amount of new transmission that is going to need to be built. And the other thing that it helps that additional transmission capacity helps do is it brings on new lower cost resources, and these tend to be new wind, solar, and storage generation resources. If you look at resource maps across the country, like where the best wind resources are, where the best solar resources are, the best wind resources tend to be in the center of the country. So think of the plain states. And the best solar resources are in the southern part of the country. So think southwest, like central, south, and then southeast, where Florida is located. Really has excellent solar resources. So part of our challenge is getting electrons from those areas to sources of load, which tend to be on the east and west coast of the country. And again, if you look at studies of power systems and the best way to do this, studies consistently show that a optimization of the generation and transmission mix where you are balancing local generation, things like rooftop solar, and things that are closer to load, along with some of these more abundant resources that are further away from sources of load. That mix, that optimal mix, is what can provide the lowest overall cost system to consumers. And it also helps to transition the power system away from older, more inefficient thermal generating resources. One of the reasons for this is that big transmission lines, high capacity transmission lines that you were talking about, David, these are the like large metal lattice towers that you see while driving along a highway. Those are deliver significant economies of scale. So they're much more efficient at delivering power, and they can do so at three-quarters of the cost to consumers over the life of the investment. So it's really important that we spend time investing in those large scale transmission lines. The other piece I'll add is that even though you see power lines all over the place, we actually have an overall power system that is less connected than you think. The electric utility industry formed as a bunch of small utilities that kind of grew out of urban areas and slowly spread their service territory out into the country. And so you have this patchwork of legacy transmission systems that have slowly developed connectivity over time as people have started to realize that there's actually a lot of efficiencies and cost savings that come from sharing and pooling resources. It helps to reduce the overall need in terms of generation investment if you're able to share resources with your neighbor. And so increasing those connections between different transmission systems has significant savings for consumers and also allows consumers to access new resources. The other thing that those transmission lines between regions can do is it allows you to take advantage of what we call temporal or geographic variation in terms of demand for electricity and also resources. Basically, that's a technical way of saying that the sun may be shining in Florida, but it may not be shining in Tennessee or something. But if you build a transmission line between the two, you can deliver solar electrons to Tennessee. And the same thing is true with load. I think the easiest way to think about this is, or like demand for electricity. The easiest way to think about this is thinking about a time zone where you maybe have two regions that are right next to each other, but there's a time zone line running between them. And so there are some folks on one side of the time zone that are getting home at 5 p.m., firing up the appliances in their kitchen and starting to cook dinner while other folks are still at work. You have more electricity demand in the region that's an hour ahead based on time zone. And so if you have a transmission line that runs between the two regions, you are able to take advantage of those variations in demand for electricity. And it allows for the sharing of resources and more efficient use of those resources at the time. I'm sure we'll get more into the benefits of transmission, but I think I can end it there.
Cool. Thanks for painting that broad overview of the transmission system as it looks and the benefits that it can create across the board for us. We'll go a little more specific and dive a little deeper now. Adam, let's dive into Order 1920, and later we'll relate it back to what Zach was just talking about. Can you explain what this order is and what its key requirements are? And along with that, what shortcomings in today's transmission system does this order seek to address?
Sure. Thanks, David. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here. Order 1920 has the title Building for the Future Through Electric Regional Transmission Planning and Cost Allocation. It's essentially a rule that an agency created, and the agency being the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which goes by the shorthand FERC to those that are familiar with the agency. And it's important to take a second to just first kind of level set and say what FERC is. So FERC is a very important agency that regulates both the interstate gas pipeline network as well as the rules that govern the interstate transmission system and the wholesale electric markets. And so really FERC fundamentally plays a kind of core role of regulating the infrastructure that serves our domestic energy needs. They also do regulate some LNG facilities, which I guess is not quite domestic, but primarily that's what they're operating under, is making sure that we have sufficient infrastructure to serve the domestic energy needs of the country. And their remit is to make sure that the rates that are charged for services are just and reasonable. And so with Order 1920, what FERC essentially did was it looked at the transmission planning that had been going on under the existing rules that FERC had created, and essentially said that these were no longer creating just and reasonable rates. And the commission essentially took a big kind of broad view and looked both at what was being done within other regions, which I'll get into more of a description of what regions mean in this context, but also looked at information that was being supplied to the commission through organizations like Grid Strategies. So thank you for that great work, Zach and your colleagues, but provided FERC with a lot of information about the current state of the transmission planning, what was getting built, the kind of anemic transmission development over the years that was using this transmission planning processes. And so essentially what they looked at and said, okay, there are ways that we can improve the planning process to make sure that regional, which in this context means a kind of a territory of several utilities, which could be within a organization like a regional transmission operator, or it could be within a state like it is in Florida, that is essentially a combination of several state utilities that then are boxed in under a transmission planning organization, which in this case is the Florida Reliability Coordination Council, or FRCC. There's going to be a lot of acronyms that get thrown out in trying to parse through this order. So I apologize to everyone who is scared away by acronyms. But so what the commission ended up doing was it looked very specifically at what was being done in regions like the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or MISO, and saw that they were doing transmission planning in that region that looked further into the future than transmission planning was required to do under the existing order that had been passed in the 2000s, and saw that they were evaluating them on a kind of a broader set of benefits and a kind of a different set of scenarios, and saw that there was a kind of a better way to do this. And so FERC passed Order 1920 essentially set out a set of requirements that every utility that is operating in the wholesale energy markets has to essentially, that is transmitting electricity across interstate lines, has to comply with. And essentially what the order does is it says, utilities, you have to look out 20 years into the future, and you got to develop a scenario that looks at a broad range of factors and looking at things like, what is the utility committed to building? What have they said in their filings? What are the states saying that they're obligated to do under their laws or regulations or policies? What are local municipalities? A whole suite of scenarios, and ultimately creating a realistic set of scenarios of what that future could look like, and then evaluating the transmission needs across some benefits, so 7 benefits that are mandatory. There is flexibility in the rule for transmission planners to be able to require different sets of benefits or looking at slightly different scenario factors, but there's at least a baseline of what is required. And I should also be clear that while the order does focus on regional planning, so planning between utilities within a set region of the United States, there is also a requirement to do interregional transmission planning. The rule is not as robust in terms of the requirements and the mandates for that. And so it's something that I think we, as Zach mentioned, is really valuable and we need to continue to push on for. But the real crux of the order and what we anticipate happening is much more robust regional transmission planning within those regions to really be able to visualize what the benefits of transmission could actually be to Zach's point, connect the renewables that are going to be built over the next 20 years, and also to drive down costs on consumers over that lifetime of the asset. I should also mention that there are some other pieces of this that are really valuable in the order that the utilities are mandated to consider grid enhancing technologies. And that's huge because these are technologies that don't necessarily require building a huge new line, but can be put relatively cheaply in the context of the cost of building a brand new transmission line. And there hasn't been an adequate incentive in the past for utilities to seek out deploying grid enhancing technologies because their return on investment is not as great. And that is a big barrier for some of them to consider deploy these, but the benefits can be really high for consumers. And so that's one thing that's really valuable. And there is a whole other component of the rule about cost allocation, which I'm not going to get into because I think that we're talking about Florida and there's different kind of unique perspectives that as a one state ISO or not an ISO, one state planning region is going to be a little bit different than other places. So that's 1920. It is a big solid reform. But I should also emphasize that there are a lot of pieces of the reform that we did not see put together into the final order. There is still some overlapping planning processes that are not fully aligned. So while there is some parts of the rule that align local transmission planning, which is like what the utility would do within its own territory solely, that is somewhat aligned with the regional planning. But there are other regional plans that are still active that were created under different FERC orders that are not fully synced with this. And so could create results in the transmission planning that aren't as valuable at the end of the day. And that's just something that we are actively pursuing as potential reforms in the future on the FERC order.
I should mention here that Order 1920 is itself almost 1,400 pages long, so I commend you, Adam, for breaking that down into a very short, bite-sized summary of it. That is no small feat. So Adam mentioned some benefits of regional transmission projects that Order 1920 says transmission owners need to consider. So Zach, let's dive into that a little bit more and talk about this list of potential benefits. So what are these benefits according to 1920? And how do they relate to and encourage clean energy and climate resilience? Can you give an example or two of where considering multiple benefits has made transmission planning more effective?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And building off kind of what Adam laid out so nicely in terms of Order 1920, it really established some kind of common sense transmission planning reforms. It requires that regions look out 20 years into the future. It says that they should look at multiple scenarios and that they should consider best available public sources of data. There's some pretty straightforward reforms to transmission planning that are much needed and should improve processes overall. Once you develop those scenarios, though, the question is how do you actually figure out what's the best solution to meeting the needs within those scenarios? And the way that this is done is through benefit analysis. And there's a pretty well established like literature and work that's been done around quantifying the economic and reliability benefits of transmission lines. And so what FERC did is they laid out requirements for regions to consider 7 economic and reliability benefits. The benefits themselves aren't actually tied to climate change. That has been maybe a bit of a misconception, but the benefits are tied to what can help consumers the most. As an example, one of the benefits, there's a term called production cost savings, but essentially what it means is it says that adding new transmission capacity, building a new transmission line may allow access to lower cost energy. Most of the time, that means that you're building a transmission line to access new wind or solar resources. Those resources have no fuel costs. And so that is a lower cost energy that gets dispatched first within normal utility operations. And so when you build transmission lines to access those low fuel cost resources like wind or solar or batteries, you actually lower the overall operational costs of the electric utility system. And so you can quantify that with something called production cost savings. One of the other benefits that said transmission planners should consider under Order 1920 is mitigation or ability to like reduce outages or impacts of extreme weather events. And so this is again important for folks in Florida who may be facing increased extreme weather events such as hurricanes or significant heat waves. If you are able to build transmission lines that can bring in more power to the region, if there's a heat wave and some plants aren't operating properly or out for like emergency maintenance reasons, you can quantify that benefit for consumers. And same thing for like a hurricane, if you can quantify the benefits of being able to bring the system up more quickly and reduce overall outage time for consumers. So those are just like a couple of examples of the benefits. I talked about some of the others in my opening statements, but you can also quantify the reduction in need for overall generation if you're able to share power between neighbors. So if Florida were to build a transmission line to the rest of the Southeast, and that reduces the overall need for generation because they can share power, that's a quantifiable benefit of transmission that Order 1920 says transmission planners should consider. The quantification of benefits is not as standard of a practice as it should be, but there are some regions that do it well. Adam mentioned MISO, or the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. You can think of them as the grid operator for the Big Ten states or like the Midwest. They have done this long-term planning for a few years now. They've done a couple cycles of it in what they call their long-range transmission planning. And some of these tranches that they've developed, they've done extensive benefit cost analysis of these plans that they've developed, and they found significant benefits. Their most recent plan, Tranche 2.1, underway right now, but their first plan, Tranche 1, was a $10 billion investment in transmission lines. This sounds like a pretty significant investment, but what they found when they did analysis was that the actual benefits from this project are likely between 27 and 37 billion dollars. So this translates over the lifetime of a project to like 2.6 or $2.60 to $3.80 in benefits for consumers in MISO compared to every dollar invested. So they are pretty significant benefits over the course of the project. And we just, as Grid Strategies, actually did an analysis looking at this. And these benefits that we're developing, they seem abstract, but they actually do have meaningful impacts on folks' electricity bills. And so when you are investing in these large scale transmission lines, you are creating all these benefits that we're talking about. And those lead to savings on your utility bill in the forms of lower energy costs. And so in MISO, where they're doing these significant transmission plannings over the course of these investments, MISO customers right now could see upwards of $200 in savings over the life per year over the lifetime of their project on their electricity bills. MISO is continuing to plan on more transmission lines as well. So those savings could be even higher. So yeah, I'll leave it there. There are other regions that are doing this planning as well and have found similar benefits and savings for their consumers.
Thank you for that description, Zach. I think the affordability benefits are clear based on those numbers just from the MISO example. So I'm really excited to hear what the benefits could be with this type of planning elsewhere in the country. Adam, I want to go back to another aspect of Order 1920, one that you mentioned earlier, which is the categories of factors transmission owners are supposed to consider when they're looking at long-term needs. And specifically, I want to talk about the category requirement to consider laws, regulations, and policy goals that affect the energy resource mix and demand. So Florida has numerous local and tribal governments that have clean energy and transportation electrification goals. So what I'm thinking is, how can improved transmission planning that aligns with Order 1920 help Florida cities and counties and tribes to achieve their goals? And how can they make sure their goals are sufficiently accounted for in the utilities' updated planning processes?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, and I think that unfortunately for viewers, I think the problems with the software have taken away my virtual background, so you now are seeing inside my basement office. Apologize to everyone that has to witness that.
Well,
So just a couple things. So I think there's two sets of laws, regulations, and policies that the transmission planners have to consider in development of the scenario. So there's two kind of larger buckets. One is, as you said, David, there's the federal, state, local, and tribal laws affecting resource mix and demand. And then there's also a separate bucket of laws and regulations and policies that are related to decarbonization and electrification. And it's important to make the distinction that there are these two buckets, because I do think that when we're talking about how improved transmission planning could benefit these jurisdictions, I think there's two things that are happening. One, there's a number of these municipalities that have clean energy policies, clean energy priorities, ordinances, incentives, et cetera, that won't be fully realized if there's not transmission. To Zach's point, if there is a county that is incentivizing the development of a renewable generation resource, if there is no transmission line that goes there, then how are they going to be able to connect? So thinking about being able to really evaluate what is happening in these places, sufficient to like know what the needs are, is really important. And it just seamlessly dovetails with being able to be able to see what those benefits and tangible benefits would be for the communities. Also things like building electrification, transportation electrification, right? If there's a fleet that's going to be going in a certain community, they need the transmission capacity right on that grid. They need the electrons to be able to power those buildings, to be able to power those vehicles. And that's a very crucial piece of it. And it really is tangible when it comes down to kind of what are these communities actually doing. But this is why the rule considers the information, right? This is the crux of it. But the problem is, and I don't know if this is part of your initial question, but the problem with this is that the order, unfortunately, did not require the utilities or the transmission planners to go out and get this information themselves. So in the case of federal laws, state laws, they are under an obligation to get that information. When it comes down to local, tribal, it's not. So it's not on their. It's not their responsibility to find that. So what this means is that it's creating a structure where these local communities, these tribal communities, have to start to get the information together, have to pull it together and line up and analyze whether or not these laws and regulations and policies actually fit within the kind of buckets of factors that FERC has laid out. So it's requiring not only some kind of legal and regulatory analysis, but then it's requiring resources to actually be able to go through the books and get them out to the transmission planners and the utilities in certain cases. Really what that means is that as many communities are dealing with imminent fire drills all the time, right? Dealing with kind of the realistic needs of the communities, there's not a lot of capacity to do that. And so really it is going to be important to figure out this now, get the information out, educate these communities now so that they are prepared, and also start thinking proactively about the resources that are needed to do that work. Maybe that's tapping into some state programs, maybe it's tapping into some federal programs. There's technical assistance programs with the national labs. As I mentioned, FERC earlier, they have an Office of Public Participation and can do some work, and even just thinking about novel interjurisdictional working groups that can help facilitate that. So I think there's ways that groups are going to need to start thinking about how they can get the resources needed to engage. And just being mindful that we didn't really talk about it so much, but the FERC order, with all the planning processes, but very specifically with FERC Order 1920, there is a stakeholder engagement process that is mandatory, but yet not specifically laid out enough to say this is exactly what you have to do when you're engaging with stakeholders. And so in the case, let's use Florida as an example, in the case of FRCC, there's no obligation to do a certain set of meetings. There's no obligation to do a certain type of meeting. There's not an obligation to provide a certain set of resources. There's just a kind of an open window or requirement for the engagement. So what this, practically speaking, FRCC is just started its engagement with stakeholders in September and will be continuing into December. And so this is an opportunity as this early engagement starts with stakeholders for these communities to start learning more from about the planning process, engaging and getting familiar with the portals, the people that are involved, who else is there. It's really important because it's going to be crucial, but we are very mindful, at least as an EDF, very mindful that there are communities that just do not have the resources to do that work. And so we're really actively thinking about how we can potentially provide resources, not just as EDF, but as a community. How do we get this information out there and make sure that there's sufficient stakeholder engagement throughout? And I just mentioning that on top of the stakeholder engagement process, there is going to be multiple levels of engagement opportunities beyond that. So this is a very long and arduous process that stakeholders are going to have to be involved in. There's the filings that are made at FERC, which stakeholders can comment on and engage on. There's going to be the substantive planning process, which will have inputs as well. And so thinking a lot about kind of sustained engagement and really building up the kind of knowledge base that's necessary for this is crucial now.
I appreciate that explanation, Adam. Yeah, it's a lot for stakeholders to consider, but definitely opportunities available there as well. Zach, it sounds like there's certainly an opportunity for regional transmission planning to help decarbonize and strengthen Florida's grid, especially as the appetite for electricity in the state grows. Can you tell us what types of transmission solutions that Florida's utilities have available to seize this opportunity? And considering that new lines can take a long time to build, are there alternative solutions that we can implement more quickly and at less cost?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've touched on a couple of the solutions already. Those would be large scale, regionally planned transmission lines. There's also interregional lines, which can provide a lot of benefits. Interregional lines essentially act as an insurance policy against extreme weather and blackouts that may occur during extreme weather events. And they also bring in lower cost resources. So if Florida were to connect to the rest of the Southeast through large transmission lines, that would be very beneficial to consumers in Florida. But as you said, and as Adam mentioned, the process for building large scale transmission lines, both the planning and then also the permitting and construction, can take a long time. I think optimistically, somewhere in the 7 to 10 year range is what you're looking at, though there are examples of some of the larger multi-state interregional lines taking close to 20 years to build. So in while we still need those large scale transmission lines, there are what I would call kind of interim solutions or complementary solutions that we can do while we're developing those bigger lines. So as Adam said, Order 1920 requires the consideration of advanced transmission technologies within the Order 1920 transmission planning. So these are what are referred to as like grid enhancing technologies or high performance conductors. They're ways to increase the capacity of the existing power system, improve efficiency, and they can be installed much more quickly, often in months instead of years. And so they provide significant savings to consumers because they can maximize the use of existing rights of way and existing transmission infrastructure that we have. As an example, some of these high performance conductors are new, like modern power lines that can double the existing power flow through an existing corridor. So at Grid Strategies, we talk about this as like a transmission loading order process that we are hoping transmission planners will adopt. Broadly, that transmission loading order, it simply means working on the lowest cost, fastest to deploy solutions first, and then building outwards towards the longest, more complicated solutions such as interregional lines. And you can think of it as enhancing the existing grid, then reinforcing the system, and then expanding the system. So that's the three-step process. And Order 1920 gets us is an opportunity for planners to adopt that approach.
Awesome. Appreciate that explanation, Zach. Adam, I'm going to turn back to you for our last question here, and I want to bring the conversation back to stakeholder engagement before we wrap. So given what Zach just discussed, the utilities in Florida may have opportunities to capture lower hanging fruit to get transmission improvements done sooner. So how can stakeholders work with the utilities to ensure that they adequately consider those options? And in relation to that, how can stakeholder engagement be used in Florida to avoid local opposition to transmission that's held at projects elsewhere?
Yeah, thanks, David. I think what we're talking about here is the local projects that are going to be built in kind of the meantime while the longer term transmission planning process happens. And so I think really building on a couple of things that Zach mentioned, right? So in the case of Florida, there's going to be rate cases that are going to be coming up in the Florida Public Service Commission. And those are going to be opportunities for stakeholders to engage on a myriad of topics, right? Thinking about both what generation is being proposed, what local transmission projects are being proposed, and thinking about where are opportunities for stakeholders to think about what is going to be the most kind of cost effective in the long term, and analyzing what is kind of the shorter term needs that are relevant to the proposal, and thinking about are there opportunities to deploy an asset that is going to be able to address the shorter term need while we're doing longer term planning. So thinking about grid enhancing technologies as one example, but also there are battery storage even as a transmission asset could be another opportunity there. And so those are some of the opportunities perhaps where stakeholders can really dig in. And again, similar to what, as I described, the kind of the complicated nature of engaging with some of these transmission planners, I think there's still, for a lot of stakeholders, there's obviously a challenge in engaging with some of the public utility commissions, and just making sure that there are folks that are already engaging. And so if new stakeholders, new interested parties are interested, there are parties that are already involved in engaging in the utility commission space. And so to build on that and use it as a support to be able to kind of dig further into these issues. On the citing opposition topic, there is obviously this is something that a lot of folks are digging into right now as we're seeing kind of a landscape of renewed opposition to citing renewables and citing transmission projects. And one opportunity that we've been looking at, a couple of opportunities. One piece of it is thinking about how we can structure the kind of engagement with a community early in the process, right? And not just once the developer is filing their paperwork or files a permit application, but thinking about really like at the ground level when a project is being developed to start that engagement as early as possible. And I think framing this as how can stakeholders get involved in this process, I think there's two ways to think about it. One is you could think about it from, are you a stakeholder because you're a community member who might be impacted? Are you a stakeholder who has an interest in some project being built for some other reason? There are a number of stakeholders that could be involved, and I think your perspective is going to be different on either kind of end of that spectrum. But really doing that engagement and encouraging the engagement to start as early as possible is a fundamental piece of kind of advocacy around trying to make sure that the community is able to have a voice in where the projects get cited so that there is not opposition to the project down the line later. This is hand in hand with thinking about what are the needs of a community if they are going to help host a project. And there are a number of kind of frameworks that have been developed over time, thinking about how do you structure a kind of agreement with a community. There's been host community agreements in the context of offshore wind. There's been some in the context of transmission lines. There's been ownership partnership agreements where there's been opposition from a community that just would not cite a project on their land and they need to strike a deal with a developer. We've found that these are all opportunities to potentially expedite the development of projects that would otherwise be opposed by bringing in that community voice early, by being open and willing to negotiate with a community and not having it get tied up in where there's the opportunity for eminent domain proceedings to wind through, or where you just end up getting bottlenecked with litigation over different issues that arise from the community. And also hand in hand with that is really proactively thinking about building projects within areas that don't require new land acquisition. So that's both, as Zach was mentioning, this concept of reconductoring, which is just stringing a new wire on existing poles, essentially, or being able to use an existing corridor that has been used either for a transmission line, could even be a highway, could be a railway, some kind of other infrastructure corridor, and thinking about being able to use those to host a transmission line or even solar array, whatever it might be. Those can be really useful if a developer is willing to think proactively in that way. There's a way for projects to be built with less opposition from communities, and it gives the communities an opportunity to be able to weigh in and say, yes, we would like this to be built in our community, but we prefer it to be built here. And if the developers are willing, the utilities are willing to hear that, then it goes a long way. And so really in that respect, we're talking about less stakeholders as the kind of interested parties in getting clean energy built. We're really talking about stakeholders in the context of these are the communities that are going to be impacted by the development. Yeah, I don't know if that fully captured your question, David. That's at least kind of like how we're thinking about community opposition in the context of clean energy and potentially clean energy infrastructure.
I think that is a more than sufficient answer for my question right there, Adam. So thank you for that perspective. To the panelists, Adam and Zach, this has been truly enlightening, and I want to thank you again for joining us and for sharing your clearly abundant expertise on this topic with us. It's clear that the transmission system is an important part of the solution for achieving a clean energy future, especially if we want a lower cost way of doing so. But it can also help us mitigate the impacts of climate-driven events like severe storms and extreme temperatures that threaten electric grid reliability. And it's also clear there's more work needed for the transmission system to meet these goals. So that's where your voice as local officials, as consumer advocates, is important. The Order 1920 stakeholder engagement process is a chance to learn what Florida's utilities are planning, share your community's energy needs and grid reliability risks with them. And if you're interested to learn more, you can always reach out to us here at EDF. So thank you all for listening. Thanks again to our panelists, and enjoy the rest of Florida Climate Week.